Emmylou Harris is a woman who spent her entire life singing about love, about devotion, about promises left unfulfilled. Yet her own life was built upon separation, painful choices, and a solitude that stretched across decades. In her later years, when many artists turn to family as a final refuge, Emmylou stands alone. No marriage, no official partner, only music remains, and memories that never truly close. Behind the voice regarded as the soul of Americana lies anything but a straight path. It is a journey constantly torn in two, between motherhood and artistry, between stability and freedom, between human love and an absolute loyalty to music. Every step forward in Emmylou's career came with a cost: shattered marriages, children who grew up at a distance, and deep bonds that were never given a name. She once stood at the center of some of the most beautiful moments in the history of country and folk, harmonizing with legends, creating albums that shaped an entire genre. But when the stage lights dimmed, what remained was not glory, but long, hollow spaces where music became the only way to survive without collapsing. Emmylou Harris's story is not a conventional tale of success. It is a quiet tragedy of talent, of a brutal honesty toward oneself. And when that voice rises, people hear tenderness. Yet behind it lies a life built from farewells that were never spoken aloud. Those harsh choices did not emerge only when Emmylou Harris stepped onto the grand stages. They were formed much earlier, in a childhood where stability was always fragile and emotion was routinely placed behind discipline, duty, and silence. Emmylou Harris was born in 1947 in Birmingham, Alabama, into a military family. Her father was a Marine Corps officer who served in World War II and the Korean War. For a time, he was listed as missing in action and later held as a prisoner of war. When he returned, he carried wounds the family would never fully hear spoken aloud. In that household, there were stories that went untold, emotions that were never put into words, and resilience was treated less as a choice than as an unquestioned obligation. Military life meant constant relocation, from Alabama to North Carolina, then to Virginia. For a child, leaving friends behind, adjusting to new environments, and learning to adapt became a permanent state of being. Emmylou grew accustomed early on to standing alone in a crowd, observing more than revealing, maintaining inner order even as unnamed turbulence stirred beneath the surface. At Garfield High School in Woodbridge, Virginia, she was an exceptional student, consistently at the top of her class, playing saxophone in the school band, participating in extracurricular activities, and even being elected Miss Woodbridge. Yet behind that outward balance was not a dreamy young girl. Emmylou learned self-control at a very early age, to perform every assigned role well, to cause no trouble, and to avoid asking questions that cut too deeply. Music entered her life not through country, but through folk. The narrative, inward-looking melodies of Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Leonard Cohen offered Emmylou a safe space, one where emotion was allowed to exist without explanation. When her grandfather gave her her first guitar, it was more than an instrument. It was a doorway. Music gradually became the only place where Emmylou could say the things everyday life did not allow her to voice. And it was from this foundation, a childhood shaped by discipline, constant movement, and few spoken words, that her voice would later carry the depth and stillness that makes listeners stop and truly listen. Silence and discipline had trained Emmylou Harris to endure, but they had not yet given her a language with which to define herself. That language only truly began to emerge when she left her school years behind and entered the academic world, a space that seemed, at the time, to be leading her toward an entirely different path. After graduating high school with outstanding results, Emmylou enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She did not arrive there with dreams of becoming a singer. What she pursued then was acting. Drama promised another kind of life, the chance to inhabit other identities, to speak through others, to exist within roles that were clearly structured. On the university stage, Emmylou performed in plays, including Shakespeare works such as The Tempest. She learned how to control her voice, her movement, her timing, everything precise, everything correct, everything trainable. Yet within that very correctness, a quiet contradiction began to form. Acting required Emmylou to strain toward emotion, while music, the thing she played on the side simply to earn a living, flowed out of her naturally, without preparation or emotional force. By day, there were classes and rehearsals. By night, small gigs, simple chords played just to cover expenses. The contrast grew sharper with time. On one side, a craft that demanded study and control. On the other, an instinct that asked for no permission. In 1967, Emmylou left college. There was no grand announcement, no safety plan, just a decisive choice to walk away from a place that no longer fit. She moved first to Virginia Beach, then to New York, merging into the vibrant folk current of the late 1960s. Greenwich Village opened before her like another world. Small cafes, low stages, audiences seated close to the singer. By day, Emmylou worked as a waitress. By night, she held a guitar, singing for strangers who were searching for something to believe in. It was in this setting that her debut album, Gliding Bird, was released in 1969. It arrived quietly, poorly promoted, unable to find its footing in a rapidly shifting market. The album passed almost without leaving a trace. To many, it was simply a commercial failure. To Emmylou, it was the moment when a musical path that had barely opened seemed to close right in front of her. A stumble that nearly ended a career before it had truly begun. The stumble of Gliding Bird did more than shake her professional confidence. It pushed Emmylou Harris into a period when every role in her life collapsed onto her at once, without pause or breathing room. Music had not yet given her a place to stand, but her personal life was already forcing her to grow up far too quickly. In the late 1960s, within that cramped and precarious folk scene, Emmylou met Tom Slocum, a young musician sharing the same hand-to-mouth performance life in New York. Two young people, with little money and many dreams, clung to one another with the sense that at least they were not alone. Love came quickly, and marriage followed just as fast, almost a reflex against the instability surrounding them. When Emmylou became pregnant and gave birth to her first daughter, Hallie, her world split instantly in two. On one side was a child who needed constant presence, steady routines, quiet evenings. On the other was music, something that demanded travel, late nights, bars, and an unpredictability that could not be controlled. The trips, the sparsely attended gigs, the times she had to carry her child along because there was no other choice. All of it quickly exposed a hard truth. A touring musician's life was not an environment in which a child could grow up whole. That marriage did not collapse through betrayal or dramatic scandal. It dissolved through exhaustion. In 1971, Emmylou and Tom divorced. At that point, she had no fame, no major contract, only a young child and a musical future still shrouded in uncertainty. The hardest decision was not leaving her husband, but what came next. Sending Hallie to live with her grandparents in Maryland so the child could have a more stable upbringing, while Emmylou returned to a fragile, unsettled performing life. Emmylou moved back to the Washington, D.C. area, carrying a feeling that was both liberating and devastating. At night, she sang at the Cellar Door, Clyde's, and other familiar venues in the local live music circuit. By day came the hollow absence of not having her child beside her. It was in this space that she met Bill and Taffy Danoff, two musicians who saw in Emmylou not a future star, but a voice that simply needed to exist first. They introduced her to venue owners, helped her secure regular gigs, not to make her famous, but to help her survive. There were no bright lights, no glory, only evenings spent singing to pay rent, and a young mother learning to endure a private sense of loss so that her musical dream would not be extinguished entirely. It was during this period that Emmylou acquired something more vital than any technical skill, the ability to remain standing when nothing ahead was guaranteed. Those quiet nights singing in Washington, D.C. did not bring Emmylou Harris any closer to fame, but they placed her exactly where fate could find her. One evening at Clyde's, amid familiar faces and the worn yellow glow of old lights, someone heard something in her voice that reached beyond the confines of a bar room. That person was Chris Hillman, former member of the Byrds, and he mentioned Emmylou's name to someone else, a man searching for a female voice to complete a vision still unfinished, Graham Parsons. When Emmylou stepped into Parsons's world, everything immediately slipped off its former axis. Country rock did not demand that she abandon folk. Instead, it absorbed it, placing it alongside Southern tradition and contemporary rock spirit. In the studio, the blend between their male and female voices was not about technical display. It felt like two breaths that had always been meant to move together. GP, released in 1973, emerged from that space, not a commercial explosion, but the first sketch of a new musical language, one where fragility and toughness could coexist. They continued with Grievous Angel. Songs like Love Hurts and $1,000 Wedding carried emotions that could not be fabricated. Sorrow without emphasis, intimacy without explanation. Emmylou was no longer standing at the edge of the stage. She became a central voice in a project that aimed to redefine country music. Behind the scenes, the recording sessions were long, tense, and charged with inspiration. Parsons was both a guide and a self-destructive force. Emmylou witnessed it, but she could not control it. In September 1973, Parsons died of an overdose, just as the world had barely begun to grasp what they were creating together. The shock came too fast. For Emmylou, this was not merely the loss of a collaborator, it was the loss of the first artistic anchor that had convinced her she was on the right path. In the days that followed, the idea of leaving music surfaced seriously, not out of fear of failure, but out of uncertainty over whether she could continue without betraying what they had built together. In the end, Emmylou did not retreat. She chose the harder road, to carry another person's legacy forward without claiming it as her own. Grievous Angel was released in 1974 after Parsons's death, like an incomplete farewell, and at the same time, it placed Emmylou before a new test: how to turn loss into creative momentum rather than let it bring everything to an end. After Graham Parsons's death, Emmylou Harris entered the studio in a state difficult to name, wounded yet stubborn. She could not afford to collapse for long, because if she stopped, everything they had just brought into being would be buried as an unfinished anecdote. And so, in 1975, Emmylou emerged with Pieces of the Sky, not as a coffeehouse singer stepping onto a big stage, but as someone carrying an open wound straight into the spotlight to see how long she could remain standing. The album was not built on technical exhibition. It was built on choices, choosing songs like selecting a scalpel, choosing lyrics like deciding where to touch the pain. Among them was Boulder to Birmingham, a song directly tied to the loss of Parsons, never explanatory, yet making it clear that some deaths do not end at the grave, but continue inside the voice of the one left behind. Pieces of the Sky became a major breakthrough. Emmylou was recognized as a singer with a distinct identity, not Parsons's legacy, not the shadow of any man in the country rock world. That same year, she released Elite Hotel, and this time the impact was no longer a breakthrough, but a takeover. The album shot straight to #1 on the country charts. Covers like Together Again and Sweet Dreams were not merely nostalgic. In Emmylou's hands, they became letters written by a woman who had truly lived through fracture. Songs not sung to impress, but sung as a repayment of emotional debt. Success arrived quickly, bringing with it a new pressure. She was no longer allowed to fail. A stumble now would not be forgiven as a newcomer's bad timing, but read as proof that the glow had been an accident. To keep that machinery moving, Emmylou formed the Hot Band, not to create the image of a backing group behind a diva, but to build a living foundation for her voice. Here, technique became discipline, and emotion became something controlled to a near razor edge. Musicians like James Burton, Glenn D. Hardin, and Rodney Crowell shaped a sound that was both lean and luminous, country enough to conquer Nashville, rock enough to avoid confinement, and folk enough to preserve a storytelling soul. Emmylou stood at the center like a real bridge, connecting tradition and modernity without breaking either side. In 1977, Luxury Liner pushed her even higher. The album felt like a train that was not allowed to stop, songs following one another with the speed of someone running from emptiness. Success now was no longer just charts or sales certifications. It was the sense that Emmylou was proving to herself that she had not fallen after Parsons, that the loss had not stolen her future. Yet this was also where the paradox sharpened. The more famous she became, the more her life was consumed by schedules, recordings, and the expectation to recreate the previous miracle. In 1978, Quarter Moon in a 10-cent town arrived as a subtler shift, no longer conquest by instinct alone, but the work of an artist who had learned to balance Nashville discipline with the freedom of a folk spirit. Songs like Two More Bottles of Wine brought Emmylou closer to a mainstream audience, while Easy From Now On felt like a quiet confession, calm yet deeply penetrating, about how one learns to live with loss, not by curing it, but by continuing. Throughout all of this, what set Emmylou Harris apart was not that she sang louder than anyone else or polished herself into a star image. She was almost never showy. She placed the voice at the center, not a voice meant to impress, but a voice meant to tell the truth. That restraint created weight. Listeners felt that she was not performing sorrow, she was carrying it. And in a period when country music could easily slide into formula, Emmylou became another path entirely, an artist standing between folk, country, and rock, preserving tradition while opening the door for a new generation to step into Americana without asking permission from anyone. As the machinery of success accelerated, Emmylou Harris did not simply need a romantic partner, she needed someone who understood the pace of work that was consuming her entire life. Brian Ahern entered her world in that context, not as a chance love encounter, but as a professional alignment forged in the recording studio. He was the producer behind the albums that carried Emmylou to the top, the person who understood every pause in her voice, every song choice, every seemingly minor detail that ultimately shaped the emotional core of a record. From collaborators, they moved into marriage in 1977, almost the logical next step for two people living within the same creative rhythm. In the early years, the partnership created a rare sense of completeness. Work and private life merged, with no clear boundary. Brian was in the studio when Emmylou needed someone she could trust absolutely. Emmylou was on stage when Brian needed a voice capable of realizing his production vision. When their second daughter, Megan, was born in 1979, the small family seemed to have found the balance Emmylou had long been missing. But it was precisely then that the cracks began to show. Tours do not wait for a child to fall asleep. The studio does not pause for a family dinner. One trip followed another, deadlines piled up, and creative decisions no longer stopped at work, but seeped directly into private life. When both partners lived entirely for music, no one remained to keep time for the family itself. Emmylou kept moving. Brian stayed behind the mixing desk, and the child grew up in the space between two perpetually busy adults. There was no dramatic explosion, only accumulated exhaustion, the kind that leaves no energy for argument, only the option to let go. In 1984, the marriage ended. For Emmylou, this was not just another breakup, but the collapse of the belief that love and work could coexist without harming each other. Feelings that had never found expression in her private life began to seek another outlet. They did not turn into scandal or public complaint. Instead, they flowed directly into music. The Ballad of Sally Rose emerged from that state. It was not an easy album, not something radio would readily embrace. It was a concept album, semi-autobiographical, in which Emmylou confronted herself directly for the first time. Leaving home in her youth, her relationship with Graham Parsons, her marriages, and the sense of dislocation even while standing at the center of the stage. Commercially, the album was unsuccessful, but critics recognized that something else was happening. Emmylou Harris was no longer singing to maintain her position. She had begun singing to understand who she was after everything she had lost. After the Ballad of Sally Rose, Emmylou Harris did not try to re-enter the race through safe formulas. Instead, an old idea resurfaced, quietly, yet powerful enough to unsettle the industry's order. For years, during shared stages and spontaneous harmonies, Emmylou had felt the rare compatibility among three female voices, her own, Dolly Parton's, and Linda Ronstadt's. It was not harmony meant to overwhelm, but a delicate balance, each woman retaining her identity, yet forming a complete structure when placed side by side. When the idea of trio was finally proposed seriously, resistance came not from audiences, but from record labels. 3 artists on 3 different labels, 3 major stars, each with her own brand. In the market logic of the time, this was an unnecessary risk. Country music was already conservative, and an all-female group without a single lead star in the traditional sense was deemed hard to sell, hard to position, hard to control. The idea was shelved for years, even though all 3 women knew what they held was not a passing impulse. When Trio was finally released in 1987, it arrived not as a rebellion, but as a quiet, undeniable affirmation. The album sold millions of copies, far exceeding the expectations of those who had once opposed it. Songs like "To Know Him Is to Love Him" and "Wildflowers" demonstrated that the power lay not in who sang higher, but in how 3 mature, seasoned voices placed emotion above everything else. Commercial success was followed by professional recognition. Grammy, CMA, ACM, awards rarely aligned behind a project once dismissed as unworkable. For Emmylou Harris, Trio was more than a major victory after a difficult period. It was an experience in which she did not have to carry everything alone, did not have to occupy the center, did not have to prove anything. 3 women stood as equals. No competition, no overshadowing, focused solely on bringing music to its purest state. In an industry long dominated by male power structures, Trio opened a different space, where female solidarity needed no manifesto, yet proved strong enough to change perceptions. 12 years later, Trio 2 arrived in 1999 as a reminder that the earlier success was no fleeting moment. The world had changed, and all 3 women had passed through further losses and personal transformations. But when they returned to the studio, the chemistry remained intact. Trio 2 was warmly received, not as a surprise this time, but as a belated confirmation of an idea once rejected simply because it had arrived too far ahead of its time. The success of Trio did not bring Emmylou Harris a sense of safety in her private life. On the contrary, it pulled her even deeper into an exhausting work rhythm where every relationship had to adapt to recording schedules, touring, and a constant stream of new projects. It was in this context that Paul Kennerly entered her life, a British songwriter and producer, intellectually sharp, artistically ambitious, and above all, someone who recognized in Emmylou a storytelling ability that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of country music. They met through work, communicated in the language of ideas and structure, and quickly discovered a strong creative compatibility. Their marriage in 1985 was not born of impulsive romance, but of the belief that 2 mature people, each carrying the scars of past breakups, could build a new life grounded in respect and collaboration. In the early years, the relationship genuinely generated powerful momentum. Emmylou entered a more daring experimental phase, continuing to explore the concept album format, expanding her creative range, and allowing her music to move further away from the safe territory she had already conquered. But that very creative intensity began to erode the rest of her life. When creativity became the absolute center, family no longer had space to exist on its own. Work followed them home, into every conversation, every small decision. There was no longer a boundary between making music and being a wife. No silence in which a relationship could breathe. Emmylou kept touring, kept recording, kept living in a state of holding together a machine that never stopped running, while her private life gradually shrank into a secondary role, always postponed until after this project. The tension did not erupt into dramatic conflict. It accumulated in prolonged exhaustion. Two intensely creative people, yet with no room left for the most ordinary things. Presence without purpose, days that did not revolve around songs, albums, or the next artistic direction. By 1993, the third marriage came to an end. This time, Emmylou was no longer confused or self-lacerating. She faced the reality with a clarity forged through years of heartbreak, acknowledging that she might not be someone who could sustain marriage, but she could remain decent after it ended. She once described herself as a really good ex-wife, a half-joking, half-serious remark that reflected how she had learned to let go without turning the past into hostility and to move forward without denying what had once existed. After the 1993 divorce, what remained in Emmylou Harris's hands was not a melodramatic emptiness, but a frightening stillness. For the first time in many years, she no longer had the framework of marriage to cling to, no longer had a personal life that required compromise with another person's creative rhythm. And it was precisely that stillness that opened a brutal question. If all the Nashville labels were stripped away, if all expectations that she must sound like country were removed, what was Emmylou left with? She had passed her peak, proven she could win through tradition, triumph through harmony, survive devastating loss. But survival was no longer enough. She needed a rebirth, not to refresh an image, but to rescue her own sense of being alive within music. From the mid-1990s onward, she began drifting away from the contemporary center of country music, a place ruled by radio playlists, polished formulas, and sadness reduced to a marketable template. Emmylou chose the opposite direction, toward a darker, deeper, more atmospheric sound, and Wrecking Ball, 1995, became the true rupture. She collaborated with Daniel Lanois, a producer known for creating space in music, where songs are not just melodies, but rooms filled with shadow, breath, and echo. Here, Emmylou no longer stood before the microphone as a clean, pristine country diva. She entered the mix like a figure moving through memory, her voice thin, cool, yet increasingly cracked the longer one listened. The album shattered the sense of traditional country long attached to her name, not through a manifesto against Nashville, but by proving that a mature artist has the right to reshape her own emotional architecture. Country radio might not have embraced it, but critics and attentive listeners immediately understood. This was Emmylou at her bravest. The album earned a Grammy, Best Contemporary Folk Album. And more importantly, it pulled her out of repetition and placed her at the center of what would later be clearly defined as Americana. In 2000, Red Dirt Girl appeared like a memoir written in a calm yet unyielding voice. If Wrecking Ball was the darkness of experimentation, Red Dirt Girl was the late light of someone who had accepted looking directly at herself without evasion. The album marked Emmylou's more active role as a songwriter, telling stories from an inward perspective, direct, honest, unsoftened. It made no effort to please anyone, It felt like a confession from someone who had lived through too much to still need the market's approval. The album earned her another Grammy, Best Contemporary Folk Album, reinforcing that this rebirth was not a single gamble, but a newly recognized direction. By Hard Bargain, 2011, Emmylou was older, her voice lower, and her sadness no longer sharp as in youth. It had become a form of understanding. The album carried a clear tribute to Graham Parsons, not as a nostalgic repetition, but as a turn of fate. The man who once shifted the axis of her career still lingered in the emotional underlayers, even as time had dusted over everything. Hard Bargain was received positively both critically and commercially at a solid level, showing that Emmylou had retained her audience in a musical world far removed from the 1970s. And then, in 2013, Old Yellow Moon with Rodney Crowell arrived as a graceful landing point in a lifelong artistic journey, no longer needing to prove anything through aggressive experimentation, but through maturity itself. This was music only the deeply lived-in could make. Simple yet suggestive, gentle yet firm. The album won a Grammy, Best Americana Album, serving as a quiet confirmation that Emmylou Harris had not merely passed through Americana. She had become part of its definition, a voice that could step away from the country radio system, yet remain firmly rooted in the hearts of those who regard music as a refuge, not a competition. And when Old Yellow Moon closed with a Grammy in 2013, Emmylou Harris also brought to an end a cycle that had lasted for decades, the cycle of having to prove herself musically while simultaneously trying to preserve a private life continually overtaken by work. At that point, she no longer needed another artistic rebirth. What remained was a far simpler yet much harder question to answer. How does one live after all the experiments are finished? After the divorce in 1993, Emmylou Harris did not step into a new chapter of life with grand declarations or a headline-making romance. The change came more quietly, but more completely. She did not remarry. She did not attempt to fill the empty space with another version of family. Instead, Emmylou chose an entirely different structure of living, one not centered on marriage, but on the rhythm of music, on relationships deep enough not to require binding, and on a private life no longer fragmented by other people's expectations. At an age when many see being single as a lack, she regarded it as a state of balance paid for through many years of trial, error, and collapse. That space allowed Emmylou to slow down on her own terms. She continued to tour and record, but no longer allowed work to devour her personal life as it once had. Friends, long-standing relationships, and especially animals became essential parts of her daily existence. This attachment was not a replacement for human connection, but a form of presence without judgment or demand. Something Emmylou had long lacked during the years when she had to simultaneously inhabit the roles of wife, mother, and artist. When she became a grandmother in 2009 and again in 2012, her life gained another rhythm. No longer the pressure of raising children within a relentless professional machine, but a selective presence, close enough to love, distant enough to avoid repeating old conflicts. Family was no longer a force competing with her career. It became a gentle anchor, supportive without consuming, present without requiring sacrifice. At the same time, Emmylou devoted increasing energy to social causes. Benefit tours for Landmine Free World reflected her long-standing concern for the consequences of war and its forgotten victims. The founding of Bonaparte's Retreat revealed another side of her character: patience and dedication toward vulnerable lives without the need for a spotlight. Her work with PETA, MusiCares, and the Bridge School was not driven by fleeting trends, but sustained and quiet, much like her music, unobtrusive yet enduring. During these years, the media repeatedly questioned unnamed relationships, particularly with John Denver. No confirmed romance, no evidence of a secret love life ever emerged. What existed between them was a spiritual and musical connection, deep enough to invite curiosity, yet clear enough not to require explanation. Emmylou chose silence not to conceal anything, but because she understood that certain values, once spoken aloud, would immediately be reduced, misunderstood, or consumed as anecdote. In later life, Emmylou Harris's most significant choice was not whether to have someone beside her, but whether to retain the right to define her own life. No longer needing to prove her happiness by any external standard, she lived within a structure that felt complete on her own terms, one where music remained central, but no longer swallowed the rest of her humanity. Emmylou Harris's legacy does not lie in how many records she sold, how many Grammys she won, or how many honor lists included her name. Those numbers are merely the easiest parts of a far more complex journey to measure. Her true legacy lies elsewhere, in how she quietly expanded the boundaries of country music without destroying it, how she brought folk, rock, Americana, and inner vulnerability into a genre long accustomed to rigid forms. She did not do this by declaring herself a revolutionary, but by persistently singing in the way she believed was right, placing emotion before market demands, story before technique, and honesty above image. For decades, she became a point of support for other artists, the voice behind the microphone lifting others through harmony, the collaborator willing to step aside from the center, the proof that a female artist could mature alongside her music, change with time, without having to reinvent youth to remain heard. For later generations, Emmylou stands as living evidence that endurance can outlast spectacle, that a voice need not shout to leave a lasting mark. Her life also leaves behind another legacy, quieter, yet no less important: the right to choose, the right to change direction when acting no longer fit, the right to leave marriages even when love had once been deep, the right to reinvent artistically after passing the peak, and the right to live an old age without justifying solitude, because it is not loneliness, but the result of understanding precisely what is needed to avoid losing oneself yet again. Emmylou Harris is not an icon because she was perfect. She became one because she dared to live fully with contradictions that could never be reconciled, between family and career, tradition and reinvention, love and freedom. Her music, therefore, is never merely entertainment. It is a refuge for those who have been lost, who have had to choose, who understand that some paths cannot be walked side by side. And perhaps when that voice rises, lower now, slower, yet still carrying a rare clarity, people do not hear just a singer. They hear an entire life that has passed through countless crossroads and still stands steady in the end, not at the center of the spotlight, but in a place where music has retained its dignity.